Evening, everyone. Good evening, my dear students. It gives me much pleasure to introduce our much awaited guest, Dr. Usha Ramanathan, with us, who will be speaking on reimagining technology. Ma'am works on jurisprudence of law, poverty, and rights. She's been associated with the Aadhaar case for now 12 years now. She's worked extensively on UID and has assisted the petitioners in filing that case. She's also been awarded by an organization, Human Rights Hero Award in 2018. And we truly believe, ma'am, that you are a champion of human rights. Welcome virtually to an LUO, ma'am. Now, this group of students primarily is the students who have chosen a paper on women in law and how it intersects with other provisions of law. But since the event is open for all, there are students who have joined from other semesters and years, even first year students, I can see some of them. So it's a mixed crowd.
Sure.
Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you. So let me start with saying why I'm asking for reimagining technology. There is a certain kind of imagination about technology that we have seen in the past 20 to 25 years. And this imagination is a mixed bag. It's had some very exciting and explosive moments. It's also had some things that are not so exciting and which are, which one needs to concern ourselves with, which we need to worry ourselves about. And we're going to talk about both these. I'll start with making a few broad statements. And as we go along, let's see whether they get contested or whether they get reinforced. Let's just take a look. So the first thing is that we often hear people say, technology is neutral. And the question is technology really neutral? And if it's neutral, what is it about technology that we need to be excited about? And what is it about technology that we need to be anxious about? The second kind of thing that concerns me and has been concerning me increasingly over time is that, when technology first started, when technology came to us, the modern forms of technology came to us in the past 20, 25 years, we started off with a great deal of anticipation and excitement when technology came to us. So whether it was the internet, whether it was suddenly being able to do email and being able to, be in touch virtually immediately, whether it was the mobile phone, which kind of freed us from having the phone in a fixed place, and we were able to walk around with it. Very soon, the mobile phone became a feature phone. Then it became a smartphone, and you could carry the whole world in your pocket. So all these have been the excitements that we have seen about technology. And then along came social media, which meant that suddenly, not only were we able to see what is happening in the world, but we were also able to connect to the world directly and speak to the world. These are extraordinary things. And if we look at the way the past 300 years have gone, there have been moments like this in the past 300 years. Maybe you can think of the Industrial Revolution as something that completely changed the way in which people lived. Then we can think of oil. I'm just giving you patchy things within this. You can look at oil and see what it was that oil did to our lives. Then you may want to look at, say, the motor car, the automobile, the aeroplane. These are all things that have dramatically made our lives much more exciting and much more connected. But we know now with climate change that it has also brought many other things along with it. I'll just pause for one moment to say hello to Dr. Yogesh. Hello, before I carry on.
Namaste, madam.
Namaste.
Most welcome, sir. Ma'am, on behalf of university, we welcome you.
I'm very happy to be welcome. Since I've been there before, I'm happy to be welcome back, in fact.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
So just to
Our
go
Vice
back.
Chancellor is also joining in a while.
Yeah. She's an old friend, so I'll be happy to see her.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. So this is how we've seen, this is what we're looking at in terms of the technologies that are emerging in our midst. in the past about 7, 8, 9 years, we've seen, the first 10 years of technology, of this form of technology, has been a very exciting period where everything seemed to explode us into the world, where everything seemed to be something that was opening up things to us which we never knew could happen. But in the past 6, 7, 8 years, that has been changing a little, and we've seen the introduction of an element of anxiety into this. We worry about some of these things. For instance, social media, we worry about how toxic social media is and how much it's creating these bubbles, and how between the bubbles there is so much toxicity. It's not just been a means of communication. It's not just been a means by which we find out what is happening. We are not introduced to different parts of the world and literature from different places, but we are also being exposed along with it to a great deal of fake news, of hate, of things that we need to really worry about. It's the toxicity. We worry, for instance, or we should worry about what is happening with the smartphone, with the phone. Because a phone that was a medium of communication for us is today becoming a means by which surveillance, real-time surveillance can be launched on people. It is changing the relationship between the state and the people. And that's something that we need to be thinking about. It is also putting a lot of power into the hands of companies who want to make money out of the data that is about our personal information. It may be information about our health. It may be information about the transactions that we are involved in. It may be tracking us through time, across activities. It may, for instance, be tracking us literally from place to place. RFID technology, GPS technology, these are things that can actually track us from place to place to place. So this is something that we are getting more and more, we should be getting more and more concerned about. But I want to go back a little bit and just talk about another form of technology that existed and the various ways in which these concerns about technology may emerge. So and I'm going to talk to you about an area that is not related to this, to the kind of information and communication technology that we are talking about, but about something that happened about 140 years ago. All of you have heard of Edison. All of you have heard of Thomas Alva Edison. Now, Thomas Alva Edison is also known generally as one of the persons who discovered electricity. And he had a company which was looking to popularize the use of, today, if somebody came and told us we don't have electricity, that's the problem. But at that time, they had to sell the idea of electricity to people and commercialize electricity. So Edison, at that time in his company, was trying to make, he was trying to make electricity something that he could sell to the people commercially. At that time, the US government was having some concerns. If you followed the death penalty debate in the US, you will find that they have a clause there which says that no cruel and unusual punishment can be imposed on anybody. So the question then was, at that time, people would be hanged in the US, and they were worried, the administration was worried that courts may strike down hanging because that would be considered cruel and unusual punishment. So the story goes, there's a book called Executioner's Current. And when you read it, you'll find that the story goes that the US administration wrote to Edison and they asked him, would it be possible to use electricity, that is the electric chair, to do away with this idea of cruel and unusual punishment? So what he was asking, what the administration was asking, was that there should be no, when you use electricity, it should be immediate. Death should be immediate, and it should not be of a nature which will make that death sentence, the execution, cruel and unusual. Edison wrote back saying, I don't believe in the death penalty, and I'm not going to answer this question. Now the administration didn't know what to do. They tried finding out from other people, nothing happened. A year later, they went back to him and said, we understand that you don't agree with this. We understand you don't believe in the death sentence. We are not asking you to believe in it. We are just saying, give us your professional advice on the electricity. Now, at that time, Westinghouse had come up with alternating current, and Edison was dealing with direct current. Edison thought about it, and he needed to get into the, get into the business, the commercializing of electricity. So he wrote to the administration saying, I don't approve of the death penalty, but I can tell you this, that if you use electricity, it will not be cruel and unusual punishment. Use alternating current. His idea was that once you use alternating current, he would then advertise alternating current, which was the current that was being, by being created and being sold by Westinghouse. He would then advertise that as the killer current and discourage people from buying that. Instead, they would all come for direct current. I'm just telling you this because it's kind of, the commercial competition that happens between companies can sometimes decide the rights of people and the wrongs of states. So this is an extraordinary story. I think, it's like a well-documented, very well footnoted, so you can't even deny the correctness of the story, which tells us that someone who many of us have considered a hero for years, Edison was quite the scientist. I mean, he was a remarkable creator. And yet this was the kind of decision that was made because of the need to commercialize and make money out of a technology. So this is not, and this is just to tell you that these are not new debates. The debate about why companies will ask for certain things to be used, even if it violates the rights of people, is an old debate. And it's also true that these, nobody can deny that electricity has in fact made people's lives much better. So it's to say that there is, the question is, what do you use these technologies for? So at this stage, I just want to make a distinction between science and technology. In my understanding, science is about knowledge and the production of knowledge, and technology is about the production of tools. So technology produces tools that people can use. And if we remember that, then the way we think about technology and the way we think about the adoption of technologies will be very different. Now, to move a little further ahead, in 2010, there was a book that was written called IBM and the Holocaust. I'm going to tell you the bad stories first, and then we'll come to the good stories. So the bad story is this, that all of us know about the Second World War. All of us have heard about what happened with the Nazis and how the Nazis treated not only Jews, but a whole host of people. There were about 6 million people who are supposed to, who were calculated to have been killed by the Nazi war machine. They were all put in camps. They were identified. It's remarkable. It used to make me wonder, how did this, how did the Nazis know that somebody was 1/8 a Jew? I mean, it's like you need to know pedigree to such a great extent. How do you know that someone has 1/8 of Jewish blood in them? And then you read IBM and the Holocaust, and you find that what they used was the census. And to use the census in an effective manner to be able to identify people and where they belong to and to whom and where they come from, they used something that IBM manufactured called the Hollerith system. Hollerith system. And this Hollerith system made it possible to create data from the kind of information that had been collected, which would help them see each person and each family and the connections between these, and who is a Jew and where did they come from over 2-3 censuses. And during the Second World War, and while that Nazi machine was on in the various concentration camps, the Hollerith method, IBM's Hollerith method was used, the machine was used to document and to decide who, when people would be sent to the labor camp, somebody would be sent to the gas chambers, somebody else would die along the way. All of this was documented using the Hollerith machine. It's an incredible feat that you find in the Second World War of the kind of documentation that was done during that time. And the point is that the technology that IBM produced assisted the Nazi regime in this completely infamous activity. So, Edwin Black has written this book, and IBM has come back to say, listen, we didn't know this is what they were using it for. We just make machines and we just gave it to them. So when someone tells you that technology is neutral, this is the kind of debate that you'll have to be confronted with. In India, we've had a very different trajectory. And a little bit, I'll do a compare and contrast between the US and India on this, because they produce very interesting contrasts. In India, we had, the whole idea of computers, computerization, and much later the internet, all of these came from the US, but they also had a close link with the defense establishment in the US. So if you look at the, look at the person who's first, who first broke the code, who first, knew how to use a computer to break codes, Alan Turing. During the war, during the Second World War, you needed to break codes if you needed to win the war. And you find how computers were used to break the code. All this was within the defense establishment. So some of these things you'll find, whether it's computers, even the internet, which was actually, some of the people who are the creators of the internet are also people who are also the people who today are speaking up saying this is not what they intended the internet to be, which is, they didn't intend it to be a lot of private spaces making money for private companies, but that it was meant to be free for everyone to use. They were all this technology emerged for many of them from what was happening within what is called DARPA, which is a research center within the defense establishment of the US. That too is useful for us to know, because then we also know why it is that we did not generate many of these things. We also know why Google employees, for instance, are sometimes up in arms saying we don't want to do the project that Google has taken because we don't want to be working for the defense establishment in this way. These are important connections. Maybe you'll start making them as you start watching the news after this. Now in India, the big moment came for Indian technology industries during the Y2K moment. You've heard of Y2K? I mean, if you've heard of Y2K, Y2K was actually the millennium bug, it was called. That is when the century was turning, and it was turning from 1999 to 2000, and then 2000 to 2001, when it was going to shift. If you go back to the computers of today, you find that the date on your computer says whatever date, 2021. Earlier, it just used to be 21, not 2021. So they were worried that after 99, when it would become 00, the whole system would collapse, because it will go back to 1900 and not move on to 2000. So all the systems that were dependent on it, whether it was the banking system or it was the nuclear establishment or it was the aviation industry, those which had become dependent on the on the computer and had linked itself up completely to the computers, they were worried that the whole system would collapse. So it was a time when World Bank, for instance, gave contracts to a large number of people, and not contracts, they gave assistance to a large number of people, countries saying, just go and clear yourself of this Y2K bug. And Indian companies, it is said that 50 to 60% of the monies that were made on clearing up this Y2K problem was made by Indian companies. So Indian companies basically went there and reset the computer so that it would not crash. Now, if you go and look at something like National Geographic, I was looking for a source that I will trust more than other sources. And I found that the National Geographic says that, okay, all these anxieties existed, but at the end of the day, nothing really happened. Those who changed their, those who reset their computers, nothing happened to them. Those who did not reset their computers, nothing much seemed to have happened to them either. So the question remains in people's minds about whether this was in fact a problem or it was a problem that never was. Either way, Indian technology companies made their killing on this, and that's where you see the birth of some of our what you may call large companies, what you may also call our emerging monopolies, Indian monopolies. Then in 1997, you see 97, 98, you see the talk begin to happen. Of course, before that in Andhra, you already started seeing the idea of e-governance, so that you will use various electronic mechanisms to be able to do governance. Governance, by the way, is a term that I don't accept. And my reason is this, that if you look at the Constitution, there is only one place in the Constitution where we really talk about governance, and that's in the article which says that the state shall govern, the governance shall be in accordance with the directive principles of state policy. That's it. So the basic thing there is the directive principles of state policy, and governance there means that the government will be subservient to the directive principles of state policy. The word governance emerged in the early 1990s, and it came to us via the World Bank. And the World Bank by then, there's a whole history to the World Bank and how we view the World Bank. But the World Bank has been setting, it dictates the language in which we do our thinking. And I'm always telling students, and I'm always telling, friends, that don't let somebody else put language into your mind. You have to make your own meaning out of whatever that language is. And if you look at what governance has meant with the World Bank, it has been to say that, if you look what happened before then, states which had been colonies earlier, the developing world as they are called, developing into something that is in the imagination of institutions, including the World Bank, they have been frustrated by people, for instance, taking making up their own minds about whether they accept this model of development or not. In India, if you look, the Narmada project, the Sardar Sarovar project, was one of those places where there was huge resistance saying, don't do big dams. Big dams may have seemed all right in the 50s and 60s. They are not a good idea now. And so there has been a huge, there have been protests, demonstrations, resistance. There has also been something remarkable that came from it, which is the World Commission on Dams, which the UN felt it had to pull together. So there was actually a World Commission on Dams, which found that there are problems if you're going to have mass displacement. And this too, by the way, is another form of technology. So the World Bank, when they came in, their idea was that people are not allowing land to be taken for projects. People are not moving when they need to move. Projects are not being completed in time. So good governance was about the completion of these projects that were considered development projects at that time in the dominant thinking. So governance was not about rule according to the law or under the law. Governance was the completion of something that had begun as a project and the execution of the project. So just briefly, the difference between governance and administration. When you govern, you are in one sense above the law. The law is not allowed to be an obstacle. When you administer, administrators administer in accordance with the law, which is why you'll find that, for instance, environmental guidelines keep changing. Environmental laws keep changing. Environmental law may exist, but exceptions keep getting made. These are all ways in which law is giving place to a certain idea of governance and the completion of development projects. So we know that this has been happening, this idea of governance, however, the idea of e-governance, therefore, comes with that baggage of meaning. Now for e-governance, when they started talking about e-governance, they said, now we have electronics. We don't need to go by legacy systems. We can change those systems and the government will now become operational through the e-way, which is the electronic way. Per se, it's not a bad idea. I mean, nothing is a bad idea per se. And the idea that you can be more efficient, that you can be quicker, that you can maintain records in a much better way than you might have been able to maintain it earlier, these are all good objectives that could have come in at that time. The one problem as lawyers we need to think about is who makes policy and who makes law and who asks for law to be made or asks for law not to be made. Because it's not only that laws are made. Many times there is an advocacy saying, don't make law on this subject. You know, you were saying that you've done work on data protection. The idea, you know, the resistance to allowing the data protection law to be made is a remarkable thing. Normally, you would expect that something that has been on for such a long time and where we can see that data is being collected in so many places, there would be, and especially after the privacy judgment of 9 judges, you would think that there would be an impetus to make a law on the subject. That hasn't happened because those who are in the policy making business of making a policy on this are people who have a few basic things. For instance, they say, you know, innovation is stifled by regulation. So don't make regulations. On the other side, people say, I'm sorry, but innovation has to be within the bounds of the Constitution. You can't say people's rights will be subservient to how you innovate. If you innovate and make a technology that, for example, let me give you one. Now we are all on our laptops and, you know, laptops or desktops, and we are all sitting here and looking at this. Now, suppose the camera on this, and it is not suppose, I think in many it does happen. The camera on it is watching you all the time, even when you've switched it off, and it is reporting, meaning that the information is going somewhere. How should a law be made on this? There are some who say, listen, this is good data. It will help us serve our customers better. And therefore, you should allow us to continue collecting this data. It will be inactive data in the sense we won't be actively looking at it. It's only a machine that will be looking at it. It will create algorithms. It will give us information. And we will therefore be merely using that information to better serve our customers. Others will call it a surveillance system. So if you only have machines that are going to have cameras of this kind, which are constantly watching you, or if you're going to have refrigerators that are hereafter going to be made, which are smart refrigerators, and therefore which will know when you have milk, when you don't have milk, whether you eat cheese regularly or not, how much alcohol do you consume in a day. Now, if this is going to be reported back all the time, and your insurance company is going to have information on this, then it's very good for your insurance company and really bad for you. It could also lead to a lot of inaccurate information. I may store a lot of liquor in my, in my refrigerator, but I may not drink very much. And yet I'll find that my premiums are rising because there are certain presumptions that are being drawn because this liquor is in my cupboard. So the idea that, so should this be bound by law or not? How many of you wear Fitbits? Your Fitbits get attached to the internet. They're connected to the internet, and how many steps you take, how fast you walk, whether you walk up or down, whether your blood pressure was high or low because of that, all manner of information is being passed on to people. Is that okay or not? And I would say that such things cannot be done unless there is already debate and the making of law on things like this. But that's not how technology has moved. So, the idea of e-governance, which came in initially, if you look at the early documents on e-governance, you'll find that they say, you know what, we need to have e-governance is a very important thing, but legacy documents are all of no use to us. So we need to create new ways by which we can create these databases. So there are certain steps that we have now witnessed in this. And now I'll come to the current issues that we have, which is the first stage in this was digitization. I don't know if any of you has considered what the meaning of digitization is and what happens when you digitize. So digitization is merely picking up that which is on a register and putting it into a computer. Now, in the first instance, that's all there is. So all your voter ID, which was being held in various kinds of registers, now get digitized, they get put onto one database. The second stage that was created in our system was the creation of an identity database. So the UID was an identity database that was created. And it's very interesting how the logic of the UID kept changing. The Aadhaar kept changing from the way in which it began to what it is today. So in the first instance, after the Kargil war, there was a committee that was set up, a Subramaniam committee. And as part of what they said, you know what, along the borders, it will help if people have ID documents. So we will identify them along the coast, along the borders, and we'll give all of them ID documents which they can keep. Because especially after the Bombay, after the Bombay invasion, there was a sense that you have to urgently do this. It had started before, and then it got precipitated into an urgent thing after the Bombay invasion. Now so initially after Kargil, it was about the coastal areas. Then suddenly that changed and it became about Bangladeshi migrants. And when you look at the Citizenship Act and how it changed and the NRC came in, you'll find that at that time the anxiety is about, so it's no longer about a threat of invasion at the border. It is about migrants who are coming and taking our resources. Then very soon after that, that gets converted and the Planning Commission is looking at how to deliver PDS to people. And they say, oh, for us to deliver PDS, we need to target people. We need to know who they are. So we need an ID system that will help us identify who they are. And that's the third stage that we come to. Then the fourth stage, they start the UID project where they say this will just help everyone who wants it to voluntarily take an ID. But very quickly, it becomes that if you do not take that ID, you will not be entitled to any of the services that are otherwise yours and to which you are entitled. The next stage after that is about making it mandatory in every database and saying that you cannot function unless you're going to be in every database with this UID number, which you have to seed into the databases. Then it is found that actually authentication is not such an easy thing. So from calling the UID a solution to a problem, now they call it the creation of an infrastructure, like you create roads. Then from calling it an ID to beat all IDs, it begins to be called a foundational ID, while all your other IDs, your PAN card, your voter ID and all the rest of it, all those are no longer, they are not foundational IDs, but they are functional IDs. So you find that this keeps shifting. The idea of what the UID is and why it is there keeps shifting. Now, as part of this idea of how you're going to govern, the RTI movement was one movement that inverted the whole thing. They said, you are not governing us. As the state, you have to be transparent to us and answerable to us and accountable to us. So they fought for and got the RTI Act. Once they, just 1 second, let me just, give me half a minute. Yes. Yeah. So the RTI movement actually brought about a shift, a complete shift, where they said that the RTI will make the state transparent to a people, while the people themselves will not be transparent to a state, but can go to the state and ask for whatever it is that they want. The ID project, when it came in, completely inverted this. They said the people now have to be transparent to the state. The state, it's not about the state being any longer transparent to a people. I'm going to tell you 2-3 books which you must read. And one book is called Automating Inequality. It's by an author called Virginia Eubanks, Eubanks. And it is something that speaks very well to what has been happening in this country. But before I tell you anything more about it, I'm going to quickly tell you the story of biometrics. How many of you believe? Unfortunately, I'm not able to see you. If I could see you, I could ask this question. But how many of you believe, when you think of it in your own minds, or you can put it on the chat, how many of you believe that your fingerprints or your iris scan are unique? How many of you believe that your fingerprints are unique? Second question, how many of you believe that your fingerprints are not just unique, but that they will remain what they are for maybe 5 years, 10 years, maybe your whole lifetime? And once you have thought about it, think about what I'm going to say now. When the UID project was started and they said they're going to use biometrics in the UID project, first they thought only of fingerprints. They did not think of any of the rest. They did not think of iris. They did not think of facial recognition. They only thought of fingerprints. But when they tested it, because there had been no test done anywhere in this country or anywhere in the developing world, in fact, in the way in which they wanted to use it, it hadn't been tested anywhere in the world. So when they tried testing it on 25,000 people, they found that even just to enroll people, 2 to 5% of the first 25,000 people that they tried, fingerprints did not work. So then they just introduced the iris. Iris had never been tested in this country. They introduced the iris. Then when only for PDS, they started with saying for PDS, for kerosene, they started saying use fingerprints to be able to collect your rations. Now you would have seen that a few days ago, there was a news report in the press saying that the Supreme Court is going to hear a case because there has been a complaint that there are a large number of people whose ration cards have been cancelled because the UID did not work for them. Now, what this actually meant is, I don't know whether it's 3 crores or whether it's a larger number, a smaller number. This much we do know, that at least a few people have died because they were not able to use the UID number to put themselves on to the ration database and to authenticate themselves every month to collect their rations. For people who are really poor, that's a huge loss. And it's resulted in deaths that have happened because of this. Today, you find that they are talking about introducing facial recognition wherever you go. They also want to, the RBI is saying, use facial recognition in some of these banking systems because fingerprint is not working, iris is not working. Even facial recognition is being tested now. And that's the extent of surveillance that biometrics automatically brings. On the side, I should also tell you to watch out for what is happening with the DNA profiling bill, because the human DNA profiling bill started a while ago, and the bill is now pending. There has been a report of the Standing Committee of Parliament, and it could get passed anytime. Please look at that bill. As law students, you need to understand what this bill is about. Those who are doing criminal law particularly, take a good look at it. Those who have anything to do with constitutional law, please take a look at the DNA profiling bill. It has huge implications. You need to have a separate session when you will just discuss this bill after you've read it. But for the moment, I just want to say that with introducing biometrics into the PDS system, people have actually found themselves being cut out of the system, and which means that they've not been able to collect that which they need. In a larger or lesser measure, that's what automating inequality is about. What she finds, what Virginia Eubank finds, is that when you automate these systems, only those who are able to operate within the way in which it has been automated will be able to get what is their due. Other people will lose access, including to things like insurance. In fact, she starts the book with her own case of falling ill and of not being able to get her insurance on time and having to fight a huge battle because it has been automated. There is no human being at the end of it. And in automation, when you have artificial intelligence and machine learning being brought into it, it has its own way of making its decisions. It does it on the understanding that it has devised over time. So it's, the Virginia Eubanks story is an important story for people to read at this point. But that also leads on to another book that was written by another person called Cathy O'Neil, called Weapons of Math Destruction. Now, what she was actually, she's a mathematician. She used to work on Wall Street till she found that actually these, the way in which algorithmic decisions are being made, they cause a lot of unfairness and unjustness, and that they actually destroy people's lives. So it's also important for you to see this book because, and see what the basic concerns are that are being brought here. Because there is one of the chapters, for instance, is on predictive policing. That is, the police will look at what the data is. They'll keep on feeding data into their computer about what is happening here, what's happening in different jurisdictions, different districts. And once that is, once they have all that information, the machine will keep making sense out of it. The sense that the machine makes. And you'll find, for instance, that there they found that in black areas, it will call for more policing because there is more, there'll be glasses being broken, petty crime, a lot of petty offenses happening in those areas. Whereas in other areas, white collar, for instance, never gets reflected like this. So the idea of who's a criminal and who's not, and which is a criminal area and which is not, and the kind of prejudices that surround it and the kind of policing that surrounds it, all that becomes reliant on the way the machine learns. So predictive policing is one thing, and the other is predictive sentencing. So they look at, the way in which data is collected, who gets picked up for offenses, who is able to produce for themselves good lawyers who can get them off the hook, who gets to prison. In the Innocence Project, for instance, they found that many of the people who sat in prisons for years and years, 23 years, 18 years, and sometimes on death row, before having been found to be innocent by a project outside the state project, many of them were people who could not get themselves good counsel. They couldn't afford the counsel that was needed. And they find themselves behind bars. Now, this information, the fact that these are the kind of people in prison, if you read the NLUD report on death penalty, for instance, and see what is the profile of the people who are on death row, the way in which we will characterize people will change in dramatic ways and produce more inequality and injustice. So you have to be very careful. If you want to use algorithmic learning, you have to be really careful about how you're going to use that information. So if, for instance, like it happened in the US, they start using the information about sentencing and who gets sentenced and how much sentence do you need to give for them. If you start using machine learning for that, then all the prejudices of the individuals who created the algorithm and all the prejudices of the people who are feeding in that information and the prejudices of the system will go to say who is more likely to need a larger, a longer sentence. So it produces its own set of problems. This is not to say don't use technology. It's to say that technology has huge, it has all kinds of implications and it is not infallible. Even with DNA, they'll say DNA is infallible. First of all, DNA is not infallible, but that's not the only thing. It has so many other things that are connected with it. It's about who is collecting it, how they collect it, the chain of custody, whether there was any contamination or not. What happens when you take it into a lab and the way in which it gets treated inside that lab? It does not require any kind of ill will. It's just that the system itself could prove to be a problem. So take a look at these. The third book that I will suggest that you go to is this book called Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff. Actually, as I'm telling you now, I'm realizing that all three books have been written by women. And all the major people who are sitting there and asking for this data to be collected and whatever are all men. So I think that maybe there is something in that too that we need to look at. See, why is it that women are more concerned about these forms of injustice and men are concerned about commercializing it? I think all the men in this group should work to change that balance and shift that balance out. So take a look at this book on surveillance capitalism and how capitalism itself produces, the technology, the kind of capitalism that technology produces is naturally surveillance capitalism. If you look at Google, if you look at Amazon, if you look at Facebook, I mean, all of you have heard about how much data they capture. I want to tell you about one more thing that's happening. One kind of, I can't say interesting because it's quite disturbing. There is a website. If you go to that website, it's called the Institute of Human Obsolescence. Obsolescence, which means becoming obsolete. That human beings are becoming obsolete in certain ways. I'm sorry, I think I seem to be echoing back. Can you hear me clearly, Nandita?
Ma'am, there is an echo. I guess I'm on unmute. That's the reason. Ma'am, I'll mute myself. That's the reason.
Acha. Sorry. So, I'm sorry, where were we?
Ma'am, Institute of Human.
Right, obsolescence. That's right. So now, if you go to that website, you'll find that this institute, the person who has set this institute up, is an interesting person. He's a, when you hear him, many of the concerns that I voice are concerns that he also voices. But he comes up with this saying that, listen, what is happening with all this artificial intelligence and whatnot is that labor is becoming redundant. There's no room for labor because all that will be done by the, by the machine. So you don't need labor. Now human beings have to recast themselves in a way where they become relevant. So what is the way in which you can recast yourself? And he has found that one of the things that this technology world needs is a lot of energy. When we are looking at the computer in front of us, we are only thinking about the plug point to which it is connected and not realizing how much more energy it requires. But actually, when you look at what energy it requires, if you take blockchain, take cryptocurrency, you take cloud, all these require huge amounts of energy. So when they say that technology is climate neutral, that it doesn't contribute to climate change, that's not true at all. Actually, it contributes hugely because it requires an extraordinary amount of energy. So he actually suggests that labor after this may have to be the production not of work of a kind which produces anything, but that the body should now be made to produce more heat so that it can contribute heat as its contribution to the economy. So he's got this picture of these people who are lying on planks with, rolled up in something which will make them produce more heat. And that is the product of their labor. Their labor is basically to lie there in these extremely uncomfortable, costume so that they can produce more heat. This is what he sees as the possibility of tomorrow, except it's already there today and he's got some 36 people who he's already getting employed like this. So the imagination that exists now is an imagination that we shouldn't be allowing to continue. We need to be careful with the kind of imagination that there is. Now, briefly, in the next 3-4 minutes, I'll just wind up with saying what this idea of an alternative imagination is. The imagination we've had in India was preceded by the imagination that the US had. So in the US, you had the companies like Google and all the rest of them who've been collecting huge amounts of data. And it's been said in the beginning, it was said that, well, they make their money by producing advertisements, which are targeted advertisements for every person. And that's how they make their money. So they need to be able to collect data about you to know what to advertise to you. But after Cambridge Analytica, we know that that is not all that data is used for. The data is actually used even to influence elections and heaven knows what else. So we know now that it is used for a range of other things. After the way in which it's being used for sentencing, for health, for insurance, we know that it's being used for many more things. In the US, you'll remember Edward Snowden, who in 2013 had come out and said, he left the US before he spoke because he knew that the US establishment would not take kindly to him. But he went out and said how the National Security Agency and the FISA court, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Agency, that court, how they were collecting data from private companies, how the court was collecting data from, how the government was collecting data from private companies. Huge amounts. This is like mass surveillance, mass collection of data without, not targeted at anything. Generally saying, oh, if we have all this data, then we may be able to stop terror attacks. And actually, 6 years after Edward Snowden said what he did, they went back to do an analysis to see if it actually happened. And they found that actually it hadn't helped at all. So you are, in the US, when Snowden came out and spoke and said that this is what had happened, the US administration said that, oh, but we are not doing this to Americans. We are only doing it to foreigners. An extraordinary thing to say, because the American establishment seemed to be saying that the rights, the Bill of Rights is only for American citizens and not for others. Of course, it was not true that they were not doing it to Americans, because they were just collecting traffic from everywhere. So it's not true that they weren't. In India, we've had a very different thing. In India, we've had, and I don't need to explain too much of this to you because all of you have been through it yourselves. When they say you have to get a UID enrollment, you have to get it. It's called voluntary. Like somebody explained, they said it is voluntary, but it is compulsory. So we've completely distorted language, and we've distorted all these ideas. So that's where we are. And without, from starting to say that with this, you will be able to get yourself, what your entitlements, it has now very quickly it became without this, you can't get anything at all. So voluntary turns mandatory. The idea of consent is taken out. And you have people beginning to say that, oh, consent is dead. Then you have consent is broken. Then you have a government and the UIDAI going to the court and saying people of this country don't have a right to privacy. Not just a fundamental right to privacy, but no right to privacy at all. And then when the court says absolutely not, people do have a fundamental right to privacy. It is not just fundamental, it is inherent, it is innate. And without this privacy right, it will not be possible for the other rights to survive. And then say that, of course, it's not an absolute right. They say, we told you it's not an absolute right. So they absolutely start doing away with that right. So if you look at the Sri Krishna Committee report, which other than Justice Sri Krishna, all the others were people who had at one time or another spoken up for the UID project. And 2 of them had actually gone to court to say that there should be no right to privacy at all. They are the ones who created the data protection law, basically, the first edition of the data protection law. Now, if you go there and see, they say that, yes, you have a fundamental right. They couldn't say you didn't have because the court had already said you have. They said you have, but you have a fundamental right only so that you can give it to the community so that it can contribute to the economy. Now, this is a very strange place we are in. So I'll come back to that later. I mean, whenever later. But for the moment, just to say that, so we've gone through this phase 2. So with privacy being systematically denied. Then the idea of mass surveillance. So in the Indian state, it doesn't matter which government. It started much earlier and it carries on till now. The Indian state is constantly saying that we are not doing this to foreigners. We are only doing it to Indians. So the idea that the state owns the people and the state can dictate to the people what they should do, and that the people only have the rights which the state says that they can have. This has become common currency today. And that's what you're all going to have to confront. When you do your constitutional law, you should know that the basic argument in the UID case, of course, there was a major argument on privacy. There was on biometrics. There was on a whole, there was on this, that the source code for what, how our biometrics is held is not even held by the Indian government, but by some foreign companies. All of these were indeed major issues. And when, but the fundamental thing in all this was the relationship between the state and the people. So the basic argument was that the Constitution and fundamental rights are not about the rights of the state over a people. It is about the limits of the power of the state over a people. It is the rights of the people which is dominant, which is predominant, and the power of the state is modulated by the rights of the people. So it's not like people have rights only which are left over. Kannabiran said years ago, he said, when we look at our fundamental rights, when we began, we only had fundamental rights. Then you had the First Amendment and you brought in restrictions on those rights. You said reasonable restrictions. Over the years, the way these fundamental rights and reasonable restrictions have been interpreted, you find that it's the manner in which the state acts, it is as if it is the restrictions that are fundamental. The rights are what is left over after all the restrictions are imposed. And to exercise those rights, we have to take permission of the state. You may have to go to the police to have to take permission. Like when Bhopal gas victims came to Delhi on the 20th year and 30th year of after the disaster, they went to tell the police people that they were going to have, on India Gate, they were going to have a sit-in. And the police said, we'll tell you whether we are giving you permission. And the Bhopalis said, but we didn't ask you for permission. We came to let you know so that you can direct traffic. So and their thing was, why do I need permission to sit in a public space? You need information so that you can make sure other people are not inconvenienced. But why do I need, therefore, to take your permission? I'm not asking for your permission. So the idea that the restrictions are fundamental and to exercise your rights, you have to take the permission of the state. This is an idea that still needs to be dislodged. And that's what the UID case also attempted to establish. One last thing, that we are now at a stage where we have crossed digitization. We've crossed the idea of identity. We've gone through a stage of ubiquity, which means that the number should be put in every database. Today, we are at the stage of datafication, which means, actually, Mr. Nilekani said it in a very interesting way. He said, it's called trickle-up theory. He said, in the US and in the West, generally, people became economically rich before they were data rich. In India, people are economically poor, which means that they have very little to contribute to the market. So he said, what we are going to do, therefore, is have all the one thing that they don't have wealth, but they have a lot of data which the economy can use. So the data should be allowed to trickle up. How will you do that? Through leaving digital footprints in every place. Every activity you do, if you are manufacturing some little something, it should go on to the GSTN. If you're going to be withdrawing, spending money on something, they want it to be cashless so that you'll know from where did it go to where did it go. So every part of it, you should leave digital footprints, because if you don't leave digital footprints, then there's no data that's being generated. Now that digital footprints will trickle up, and then companies will pick it up, businesses will pick up all the data about you and convert that into an economy. So while you have the data protection law, which is pending, you have another report that was written by another founder of Infosys called Mr. Chris Gopalakrishnan, who headed a committee that was set up by the government on to provide what is called the non-personal data framework. One thing you need to know about this is that this is not about non-personal data at all. It is fully about personal data. But it also includes other data, but the fundamental thing is about personal data. And what about personal data? Their idea is that it becomes non-personal if it is already in the public domain. So if it's already in the public domain, it's non-personal. And if it is anonymized, it becomes non-personal. So it is about you. But if someone says it's already in the public domain, and what the public domain is, now today, everything is going out into the public domain. So it's a very interesting phase we are in, because these companies want to take all this data and make different products out of our data. So, once they know what your interests are, where you are, you take even what's going to happen with this road toll tax, the FASTag. First, they said you have to have FASTag. Every car has to have an RFID. Now they are finding the RFID system is not working. It's just too far from the system. So now they've said we'll have a GPS. And the GPS will track you wherever you go. And the GPS will be linked with the FASTag, and the money will be taken out automatically. So while it will do some of those things of easing traffic, maybe, it will also datafy every person and every vehicle. That data will then be sold. So if you look at parliamentary proceedings, you'll find them saying that, we have sold Vahan data, which means the registration of vehicles. Who has bought the vehicle? When did they register it? What kind of insurance have they taken? And a range of things. This kind of information is now being sold by the government. They said they've sold up for about up to 100 crores or something. So there are businesses which are interested in getting this information. I won't even venture to go to figure out why they want this information. But everything about us, therefore, about our movement, about who we are. Now, health data is being collected in a similar kind of way. And if you read the National Health Stack report of the Niti Aayog, they say India will soon have the maximum amount of health data. And that data will then make us into a digital global player. So it's about datafication of people. It is not about delivery of services to people, but it is about preventing the delivery of services unless you become datafied. That is the place where we are today. So, every time we would ask, what about UID? It is a surveillance technology. Then Mr. Nilekani will say, no, why are you talking about UID? What you should be talking about is really the smartphone. The smartphone allows people to be surveilled much more than anything else. So, and then they say, without the smartphone, you can't survive because you have, that's another whole story on biometrics. So the three numbers that they had said would be most important. At one time in 2010, they said roti, kapda or makan is now passe. Now it is bank account number, UID number and mobile phone number. That people can't survive without these three numbers. Because these are the three things that are being used to datafy people, to collect all the data about people and to use it in various kinds of ways. So think about what each of these processes, digitization, ID, ubiquity, and datafication. What do each of these mean and what do they mean for the Constitution? The question then becomes, do we need, and like I was saying right in the beginning, they say innovation cannot be done in the midst of regulation. So don't make a law. We will do what we want. And then once the innovation is complete, make a law to fit the innovation. So we have to figure out in our own understanding whether the Constitution has to be reinvented to fit technology or technology has to be tamed to fit the Constitution. That's the place where we are today.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for such an interesting talk and asking us to rethink some vital questions which at times are just sold to us that it is for your benefit. Maybe a paternalistic state goes and sells it that, this is for your benefit. So ignore what are the pitfalls of it. And then we are caught in a trap and then some other technology comes and we, just bargain our soul, bargain our rights just for some benefits. Maybe that Faustian bargain it will hamper us tomorrow when AIs will take over human beings. That's what I believe that, once a day will come. And also with all these devices that we have, Alexa and Siri, how they developed such a technology. I was reading on it. It's just they've been snooping on us, listening, and that's why they have all these languages, Hindi, Malayalam, and others. Despite having no person doing regional languages, how can AI read and now provide services in all these languages? Is because they have been capturing our data for years now. So, but no one raises it in public, discourse, except few, and you are one of them, ma'am. Thank you so much for raising these issues for my students. Ma'am, if you have more 10-15 minutes, I have some quick questions from students, if you would like to take them. So I don't know if they can unmute. Aratrika, can you try unmuting yourself? Let me see if I can give. There is some technological fault on my part. I didn't give them rights to speak. So, I can control their freedom of speech. I'll try to unmute all. But please mute yourself. All of you, please mute yourself. Only those who want. So this is chaos. They don't know even if they're attending. Aratrika, can you try?
Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am, thank you for such an enriching lecture. What I primarily wanted to ask you is what is your opinion on Rule 5, subsection 2 of the draft IT rules, which impose upon social media intermediaries the obligation to actually trace the first originator of information and break the end-to-end encryption? Do you believe that such a liability should exist on the first originator of information, if at all? And also, don't you believe that it would massively increase state surveillance and further suppress any form of dissent?
Ma'am, I'll mute everyone because if I don't do that, then we can hear their secret talks. I guess I,
Want to do.
yeah,
I
so it's,
totally believe in privacy and won't,
Yeah.
okay. So actually, it's a question that can be asked in many ways. I think the thing to notice is that, every time a technology comes in, they recognize the importance of, they acknowledge the importance of privacy. But you'll find that very often they do not actually do anything about it. So they'll say, we'll defer it for a later time. But I've just been talking to some technologists and people working in this field who are challenging the way in which this technology is growing. And they've been telling me how the early, I won't be able to tell you properly, but there were people called cyber funks and cypher punks, not cyber punks, cypher punks and cyber anarchists. These were people who wanted to save the internet from being privatized. They wanted to save the internet from becoming a surveillance tool, and they wanted to save the internet from becoming something that the states will use against a people or corporations will use against a people or use on a people. It doesn't even have to be against. One of the key things that they had in that was encryption. See, hacking is, ethical hacking is another, but encryption has been a very important way in which people are, the technology works to protect the privacy of people. If I am talking to you and I'm sending you a private message, it should be capable of remaining private. If I am speaking and there are 100 people listening, it's among the 100 of us. The reason this has become so contentious is twofold. One, it's become the way it has because social media has become so toxic. We said this before. It's become so toxic, and we've seen a number of instances where you find that, in fact, it generates all kinds of, like when people from the Northeast found that they had to leave and they had to go from Pune and from Bangalore back to the Northeast because they were being targeted and attacked because of something that happened that was being pushed around on social media. We've seen that happen. The hatred against Muslims, for instance, which is so often you hear on social media. These kinds of things are not just about hate speech, but they very often also amount to incitement to violence. And while free speech, even the people who have supported free speech as an absolute right, when it came to hate speech with an incitement to violence, because we have in almost every society, we have the dominant communities and we have the communities that are, less powerful. It's been important for them to make that one little caveat and say that if it is speech, hate speech with an incitement to violence, then that is not really within the realm of free speech. You can't allow speech of that kind to carry on. Now that is being used to say, partly to say that you should not, all these need to be monitored. Now, is monitoring it the way to go? It's a big question. Also, I think the big question has changed because the state is basically saying, the idea of sedition has changed. The idea of the anti-national has come in. The idea of just being opposed to what the state is doing. You don't even have to be opposed to the state. If you're opposed to a policy of the state or of what a person said within the state, all these have become within state control of being something that, and we've seen that. I mean, the first 66A cases which raised such a hype were about two young people who were, about the Bal Thackeray after he died, whether you should have a holiday or not. And even that was seen as something the state can crack down on. So the idea that the state is going to be monitoring everything that we say and keeping us in check and punishing us if we go beyond those boundaries, that I think is anyway hugely problematic, whether it is in social media or not. The idea of having companies the idea of allowing companies to function is to ensure that they also, when we go to Facebook, for instance, we are always saying that Facebook has taken too much into their own hands and that they are completely uncontrolled. But that uncontrol is about taking over people's data, about manipulating people. So it's not about people speaking one to another. This is distorting that and now saying that we want you to keep a check on the people for us. Now, my understanding of constitutionalism and also of why a state exists is that a state exists to enhance the freedom of a people, not to curb its freedom. So if there are things that are being brought in which curb the freedom, then that's a problem. So if they are going to enlist, see, the classic thing is saying something, any technology should have privacy by design, which means privacy should be built into it. One of the fundamental ways in which technology has built in privacy is through encryption. So if you take that away, you're saying people don't have privacy. So my response to this really is that I don't think a state should have the power in the first instance to know everything about who is speaking what to whom. The state has no right to it. When it itself does not have that right, it can't delegate that right to an intermediary and say, now you monitor, and whenever we ask you, you have to tell us who these people are. It is the responsibility. Every technology should be privacy protecting. Having said that, and I think your second part of the question is pretty plain. Yes, it will increase surveillance. It will not just increase surveillance, it will also increase punitive surveillance. And that is never a good thing. People should be able to speak their mind. You can't have thought control being practiced. So that is really not okay at all. Having said that, I tend to remind myself all the time that these social media platforms that have been created by various companies. They have been, they've been manipulated or they've been created in such a way that they actually work at producing the effects that they have produced. These are not just happening. If so much hate and so much toxicity is there in social media, it's not because people are toxic. Actually, the system is structured in such a way because that's how conversations are being encouraged to happen. So I've been, when I say reimagining technology, I will also ask that we imagine the unimaginable. It's not unimaginable to me, but it could be for many of you, which is doing without some of these platforms. Get off them. If a platform is so toxic, and if the platform is willing to negotiate with the state so that you don't have your privacy, but they continue to have their right to do business here, get off the platform. When somebody tells you you don't have a choice, you have to show them that you do have a choice. The way you don't have a choice today is because you're being hypnotized into being on all these systems. There is no reason for everyone to be on all these systems. So use your mind to decide where you want to be and for what purpose, and get off for the rest. Remember that these are companies that are putting these kinds of things in place, and they are negotiating with the state and not with you. They are manipulating you, and they are being manipulated by the state. So why would you want to be on something like this? Isn't there any other way of communicating? Isn't there any other way of living? Make that your choice. If you think this is what you want to do, do it. But think first. I seriously ask for this. Adopting technologies and then worrying about it, there's really no point. If the technology is not good and it's not leading you where you want to go, there's no reason for you to use that technology. And I can tell you as a non-user of many of these technologies that life is actually rich and fine without any of these.
Indeed, ma'am. Many of us are now having social media breaks these days just to get away with all this negativity. And in fact, an entire industry has developed for giving these breaks. So like we have drug de-addiction centers, we have now social media de-addiction centers. I personally was off from Facebook for 4 months. Okay.
And you went back to
uh, I just went to check when Ved ma'am joined that whether it was rumor or actually, but now I've limited that. So just that. Ma'am, there is one more quick question from Raju, and then we can just continue in some next session. This was very interesting. Raju has a question. Raju, can you try unmuting yourself? If I do that, it will be chaos. Everyone will get unmuted. Raju? Otherwise, I'll read your question. His question is there any specific pattern which is seen and tells us as to how technology is affecting marginalized people, except that they are being deprived of ration in PDS? So he's asking for an example of marginalization by technology apart from the ration in PDS. Ma'am, any quick comments on that?
Yeah. So see, if you look at what happened in 2017, there were a series of notifications that were issued. And all those, there was something like, I mean, in the first instance, immediately at one shot, there were something like 183 notifications, each of which was from a different department of the government, saying that people would not be entitled to what was otherwise being provided to them unless they linked up their UID with, with the application for whatever it was. So persons with disability, if they get disability aids, they will not get it unless they link their UID with it. Persons in manual scavenging, if they are going to be rehabilitated, if they'll be rehabilitated only if they link their UID number with it. Women who are being rescued from prostitution would only be given rehabilitation if they had their number attached. So there were there were about 183 like this, and each of them said that this is seamless, and this is seamless. Now we have recently seen a document which says that actually biometrics is not, fingerprint is not working, working well, and iris nobody talks about anymore. So facial recognition, we are finding that facial recognition will now be the route through which we are seamlessly going to give this. So what effectively this means is that all this experiment is being done on a people. First, you experimented with fingerprint. You managed to get many of them onto the database, but you could not authenticate many of them. Then you tried iris, but iris was just picked up in the first instance for enrollment. After that, there was hardly any use for it. Now you've come to facial recognition. And in all of this, all the basic systems, basic entitlements which have been made available to a people, those people now have to somehow make themselves visible in the system. Otherwise, they don't get what is their due. During COVID, there were a few things that, few times when you notice some patterns of this kind. For instance, there was one which I found, scarily ill-informed way of thinking of the CEA, the Chief Economic Advisor to the government, where he said that, they were putting money into the, for farmers, they were putting money in, then they were putting money, this Jan Dhan Yojana has been created so that the government, central government can put in money at different times into the bank accounts. Now, he said during that period, all those who had Jan Dhan accounts, they had put in some money into this, some 1,000 rupees or something they put into these Jan Dhan accounts. He said in end March and up to about the third week of April, the amount of money in the Jan Dhan account kept going up. It didn't come down, which means that the government was putting in the money, but many people were not withdrawing that money. The money just kept growing in that. And the conclusion that he drew from it is that people were not in distress and therefore they did not withdraw the money. No study was done. Nobody went to find out from people why they did not withdraw the money. This is just a conclusion he came to. So if you say that in the lockdown, the first 4 weeks of the lockdown, people were not in distress, it's a little difficult to understand that people who are on Jan Dhan accounts were actually not in distress at all. And therefore, they left the money there. Later, 500 rupees was put into the account of many women who had Jan Dhan accounts. Now, in that set of accounts, they found that 46% of those for whom money had been put in, this was later, in August, September. They said 46% had withdrawn the money, but about 54% hadn't withdrawn the money. And the logic that they gave for that, saying why that money was not, they said they are keeping it for a rainy day. So why I'm telling you this is that it's not just PDS. These are various services that are being, that the state is saying that these are places where the state is coming in to assist you, but nobody is going to check out why people are not picking up what is being left for them. For the state and for the corporation, for the business interests which are in it, 50% is enough. They get enough data out of that. But what happened to the other 50%? Why did they not collect that money? Did they have a problem with biometrics? Did they have a problem because they did not know the money had been there? Did they not know their bank account? What was the problem? Nobody knows till today. So one of the themes that we have in Law and Poverty is the theme of invisibilization. It is not about being invisible, but being rendered invisible. You're made invisible because you are, the way data is collected, the way people are looked at, you will not come within that zone where you are visible. So while the UID project was supposed to make everyone visible, it has in fact contributed to the invisibilization of many people. So we don't even know what is happening to them. And in, like, I forget his Prasanna Bajpai, he had done a very preliminary kind of thing in April, where he said, okay, the finance ministry has said that they put money into the accounts. He's a journalist. He said they put money into these accounts. Let me just find out. So they went to the finance ministry website, they went to the state, to the district, to the village, they found out who these people were and whose accounts money had been put. They had stringers on the ground to find out if these people had in fact received their money. He says in his program, he says, this is a way that we felt we could at least find out if people are getting their money. He says, I'm not saying nobody gets their money, but this is, and he lists out all the people that they have asked. And he says, none of them received the money. So the fundamental thing in this is that evidence doesn't seem to matter. Some ambition about datafication and making businesses is driving this, which is also why I say we can't continue with this imagination. Otherwise, you tell me, how can it be that you have migrants moving across? Today, we are talking about having GPS systems which are going to follow every car and be able to see them. And last year, you did not have a GPS system which could say where the migrants were moving so that you could have, food tables for them along the way. If you could not give them if you could not give them the transport, if you had to shut down the trains and, and the lorries and the trucks, at least to have food or water provided to them along the way, they did not know. So when the government was asked, so how many people died on their way home? They said, we don't have that statistic. These are processes of invisibilization, and we need to understand what that does, not just to people's rights, but also to people's lives.
Thank you, ma'am. That was quite insightful and something disturbing as well, that, how state is carrying on things differentially for different people using technology and other things. It uses when it wants to, and for some others, it says it just does not have means. I thank you from the bottom of my heart for such an enriching session. We look forward to our continued association with you, ma'am, and hearing more from you on such events. Over to Dr. Yogesh. He was supposed to introduce you, welcome you, but now I request him to kindly give the concluding remarks. So over to you. Ma'am has also joined with ma'am, but she's joined as an attendee, so she'll not be able to unmute herself.
Can't you make her a panelist?
Sir, I was struggling with technology. I couldn't.
Okay.
I can unmute all. But then that results in a chaotic situation. I'll try to do that. Let me unmute all.
Okay.
If you unmute all, we can all mute ourselves. Then only those who are speaking.
Yes.
Ma'am, I have. Why is it not? Just 1 second. It's not possible. I don't know. It's not possible. It's not happening. Technology.
Okay, then
I'm so sorry.
I think on behalf of Vice Chancellor Madam and on behalf of University, I will thank Usha Madam for agreeing and for delivering such a intellectually stimulating lecture and answering all the questions. Ma'am, we need your continued blessing and support in future also, maybe physically when university reopens in July. You have to visit university physically and then interact with the students and faculty members. Vice Chancellor Madam has recently joined, so we are trying to again energize all of the system after Corona. So we are working out. So thank you so much, ma'am.
Ma'am, in the meantime,
Thank you, Dr.
message.
Dr. Yogesh. But since I'm not muted, I would also like to welcome Ved to Cuttack, and
Yes, yes.
I'll hope to meet all of you.
Yes, ma'am. Definitely, definitely.
She sent a message to me in the chat box. I'm sorry for this technological fix. I don't know how to get out. So it's just stuck up. Thank you so much, ma'am. We look forward to another engaging lecture from you. Thank you, ma'am.
Anytime.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
everyone.
Bye,
Thank you,
ma'am.
sir, for coming and joining. Thank you, everyone, for joining. We'll meet soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.